The Intergalactic Diplomatic Corps had seen many embarrassing incidents in its 17,000-year history, but few quite as spectacular as Ambassador Ava Chen accidentally reducing the crystalline sovereignty's most sacred relic to expensive sand, with what she later described as just a firm handshake. The fact that this particular artifact had survived 3 galactic wars, 2 supernovas, and 1 particularly enthusiastic religious revival only made the irony more delicious to outside observers. Less amusing was the diplomatic crisis that followed, though it did provide the galaxy with yet another data point in their ongoing assessment of humanity. Fragile, clumsy, and utterly incapable of existing in civilized space without constant supervision. This assessment, of course, was complete nonsense. But the galaxy had never been particularly good at reading between the lines. The hierarchy of species, that grand organizational chart of galactic civilization, placed beings according to their physical capabilities, technological achievements, and what the Council diplomatically termed survival quotient. At the top lounged the Apex Collective, 10-foot-tall crystalline beings who could survive in hard vacuum and considered recreational activities to include juggling plasma and arm-wrestling neutron stars. Below them cascaded a carefully ordered list of increasingly lesser species: the Vorthak with their diamond-hard carapaces, the Hegemony's silicon-based warriors, who treated lava baths as spa treatment, and the ethereal commune whose members existed partially outside normal spacetime and found physical matter somewhat optional. Humans, naturally, occupied a position somewhere between adorable pets and tragic cosmic accident in this grand scheme. They were soft, squishy, required a laughably narrow band of environmental conditions to survive, and had the audacity to die from things like falling downstairs or eating the wrong mushroom. The fact that they'd somehow managed to achieve faster-than-light travel was generally attributed to luck, divine intervention, or possibly a clerical error in the fundamental laws of physics. Nexus Station embodied this cosmic hierarchy in architectural form, a gleaming monument to species superiority where the upper levels housed the physically superior races in chambers designed for beings who considered atmospheric pressure a suggestion rather than a requirement. The middle tiers accommodated the moderately robust species with their merely superhuman tolerances for radiation and temperature extremes. And in the lower maintenance levels, carefully climate-controlled and wrapped in enough safety protocols to protect a newborn, worked the human. Ava Petrov had been assigned to Maintenance Sector 7 for 3 standard months now, and the novelty of being treated like spun glass by every other sentient being on the station had long since worn thin. Her official job description read Environmental Systems Specialist, which sounded impressive until one realized it meant she crawled through access tunnels, checking air filters while her coworkers, a polite term for the beings who barely acknowledged her existence, handled the dangerous tasks like changing light bulbs and adjusting temperature control. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd volunteered for the most remote, challenging assignment available to human maintenance staff, only to find herself surrounded by aliens who insisted on treating her with the kind of gentle concern typically reserved for terminal patients or very small children. The Hegemony representative had actually patted her on the head last week after she'd successfully replaced a circuit board, cooing something in his native language that the universal translator had rendered as such a clever little mammal. Today's particular humiliation came courtesy of Garvak, an Apex Collective warrior whose crystalline form stood nearly 11 feet tall and whose idea of casual conversation involved references to the time he'd wrestled a black hole into submission. He'd been watching her work for the better part of an hour with the sort of fascinated attention one might give to a particularly elaborate ant farm. "Remarkable," he rumbled, his voice creating harmonic resonances that made the metal walls hum. "Your species continues to surprise me with persistence. Tell me, small one, do your people truly require sleep every cycle, or is this merely a charming cultural affectation?" Ava paused in her work, wrench still in hand, and considered several responses. The diplomatic one involved explaining human circadian rhythms and the biological necessity of REM sleep. The honest one involved pointing out that she'd been awake for 36 hours straight fixing problems that his superior species had somehow managed to create through what could only be described as weaponized incompetence. Instead, she went with option 3, "We're full of surprises." Something in her tone must have registered as unusual because Garvak tilted his massive crystalline head with the sort of curiosity typically reserved for unexpectedly complex puzzles. For just a moment, the condescending amusement in his multifaceted eyes flickered into something that might have been genuine interest. Then the moment passed, and he returned to his default setting of benevolent superiority. Indeed, perhaps one day your people will evolve past limitations. Until then, we shall endeavor to keep you safe from the harsher realities of the universe. Ava smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both perfectly polite and faintly predatory. How thoughtful of you. If Garvak had been capable of recognizing the warning signs that evolution had programmed into every successful predator species in the galaxy, he might have paid more attention to that smile. But the Apex Collective had spent so many millennia at the top of the food chain that they'd forgotten what it felt like to be prey. They were about to receive a refresher course. The challenge came 3 days later, delivered with all the ceremonial pomp that the Apex Collective reserved for what they considered momentous occasions. Garvak had assembled what appeared to be half the station's senior staff in Observation Deck Alpha, their various forms of alien superiority arranged in a semicircle that would have been intimidating if Ava hadn't spent the last week fixing the deck's climate control system, and knew exactly which panels were held together by improvised repairs and prayer. Friends and colleagues, Garvak announced, his crystalline voice carrying the sort of gravity typically reserved for declaring war or unveiling new tax policies. I propose a demonstration of interspecies cooperation and learning, a training exercise if you will, designed to help our human colleague understand the realities of survival in our more demanding environment. The assembled aliens exchanged glances that ranged from amused to concerned, depending on their species' particular flavor of condescension. Brent, a hegemony commander whose silicon-based physiology made him roughly as vulnerable as a particularly mobile mountain, actually wrung his hands in what Ava assumed was supposed to be sympathy. Surely such an exercise would be too strenuous for one so delicate, he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. Perhaps a simpler demonstration would suffice. We could arrange for her to observe from a safe distance. The suggestion sparked a brief debate among the assembled representatives about appropriate human-safe activities, ranging from guided meditation to supervised breathing exercise. Ava listened to this discussion with the sort of patience that her species had perfected over millions of years of hunting prey, that was faster, stronger, and generally better equipped for survival than soft, slow mammals had any right to pursue. The exercise, Garvak continued, raising one massive crystalline hand for silence, would be a simple tracking scenario through Maintenance Sector 12. I would provide her with a 30-minute head start, and then attempt to locate her using standard hunting protocol. Nothing dangerous naturally, merely an educational demonstration of how apex predators operate in confined spaces. The patronizing tone was so thick Ava could practically see it condensing in the recycled air. Sector 12 was the station's maze of maintenance tunnels, access shafts and utility corridors, a three-dimensional puzzle of metal and machinery that stretched for kilometers in every direction. It was also, coincidentally, where she'd spent the last month cataloging every junction, mapping every shortcut, and memorizing the acoustic properties of every major corridor for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with her official duty. Of course, Garvak added with the magnanimous air of a being granting a tremendous favor, we would establish safety protocols, emergency beacons, medical teams on standby, perhaps a few observers to ensure no harm comes to our fragile friend. Yixar, whose species had evolved from pack hunters before achieving sentience, leaned forward with obvious interest. This could be educational. The human could learn valuable lessons about predator awareness and survival instincts, though perhaps we should consider a shorter time limit. 30 minutes seems optimistic for such a delicate constitution. Surely that would be sufficient for a learning experience without causing undue stress. Ava finally spoke up, her voice carrying just enough curiosity to sound appropriately naive. What exactly would constitute winning this exercise? Garvak's multifaceted eyes gleamed with what she was beginning to recognize as his version of anticipatory amusement. An excellent question, small one. Victory would be achieved by successfully evading detection for the full time period, or by reaching the designated safe zone in the central hub. Though I should mention that in my 3 centuries of hunting experience, I have never failed to locate my quarry within the first 10 minutes. The casual arrogance in that statement was so perfectly beautifully apex that Ava had to suppress a smile. 3 centuries of hunting experience, and he'd probably never faced anything that couldn't be located by following the sound of panicked breathing and the scent of fear. His species had grown so accustomed to their prey, announcing its presence through obvious terror, that they'd forgotten how to hunt anything with actual survival instincts. Fascinating, she said, and meant it, though probably not in the way Gorvak interpreted. The collective intake of breath from the assembled aliens created a small pressure differential that the station's atmospheric systems dutifully noted and corrected. Brent actually stepped forward as if to physically intervene. Surely you cannot be serious, he protested. The risks alone. What if you become lost? What if you injure yourself attempting to navigate unfamiliar passages? What if the stress of being hunted triggers some sort of mammalian panic response? I appreciate the concern, Ava replied with perfect sincerity, but I think I can manage a simple game of hide and seek. The description of Gorvak's hunting technique as hide and seek caused another ripple of what she was learning to recognize as alien distress. Yexar actually made a small whining sound that his translator rendered as, "Oh dear, this cannot end well." Within minutes, the observation deck had transformed into something resembling a command center, complete with holographic displays showing the layout of Sector 12, and real-time biological monitoring feeds that would track Ava's vital signs throughout the exercise. Medical teams were placed on standby, emergency response protocols were activated, and someone had apparently contacted the human embassy to ensure proper next-of-kin notifications were filed. The level of preparation suggested that they were launching a military assault, rather than what Gorvak continued to describe as a gentle educational exercise. Ava found this disparity between stated intent and actual preparation rather illuminating, though she kept this observation to herself. As she made her way to the entrance of Sector 12, she could hear the assembled aliens placing what sounded like increasingly elaborate wagers on various aspects of the upcoming hunt. Time until discovery ranged from 3 minutes to a wildly optimistic 8 minutes. The over-under on number of times the human will call for help was set at 7. Someone had apparently started a betting pool on whether she would attempt to hide in an air vent, because apparently that was what humans always did in entertainment media. Standing at the threshold of the maintenance sector, Ava checked her chronometer and allowed herself one final look back at the observation deck. Through the transparent aluminum viewing port, she could see the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, their various forms of superiority arranged around their monitoring equipment, like generals planning a campaign against particularly slow-moving bacteria. Gorvak raised one massive crystalline appendage in what was probably meant to be an encouraging gesture. "Remember, small one," his voice carried clearly through the comm system. "This is merely a learning experience. There is no shame in surrender." Ava smiled and waved back, her expression carrying the sort of cheerful enthusiasm that would have sent every prey animal within 3-star systems into immediate cardiac arrest. "Thanks for the advice. See you soon." Then she stepped into the maintenance tunnels and vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a collection of superior beings who had absolutely no idea what they had just unleashed. The first 10 minutes proceeded exactly as Gorvak had predicted, which should have been everyone's first warning that something was terribly wrong. He stalked through the maintenance corridors with the confident stride of a being who had never encountered prey, clever enough to make hunting actually challenging. His crystalline form moved with predatory grace, sensors extended to their maximum range, tracking heat signatures and electromagnetic disturbances with the efficiency of someone who had spent 3 centuries making this look effortless. The problem, from Gorvak's perspective, was that hunting had always been effortless. His species had evolved on a world where the local fauna's idea of predator evasion involved running in straight lines while making as much noise as possible. Apex hunting techniques had developed accordingly, focusing on overwhelming speed and superior senses, rather than anything resembling tactical thinking. Ava, meanwhile, had spent her first 5 minutes doing something that no prey species in Gorvak's experience had ever attempted. Absolutely nothing. She'd found a junction box approximately 200 meters into the tunnel system, settled herself into the shadows beside it, and simply waited. Not the frozen panic paralysis of a creature overwhelmed by terror, but the patient stillness of something that had learned the value of not moving until movement served a purpose. The monitoring station buzzed with increasingly concerned commentary as Garvak's confident progress through the tunnel system failed to produce the expected results. Brent had pulled up holographic displays, showing both participants' locations, and the fact that they were moving in seemingly random patterns was causing visible distress among the observers. "Curious," Yexar muttered, his pack hunter instincts apparently more finely tuned than his colleague. "The human's movement pattern makes no sense. She appears to be circling back on herself." "Panic," Clave declared with the certainty of a being who had never experienced actual prey behavior. "Classic disorientation response. She's probably lost already." This assessment would have been more convincing if Ava hadn't spent the previous month creating detailed mental maps of every maintenance corridor, service shaft and emergency access route in this section of the station. What looked like panicked wandering to the observers was actually a carefully planned route that took advantage of acoustic dead zones, thermal shielding and the kind of three-dimensional thinking that came naturally to a species that had evolved climbing through forest canopy. By minute 12, Garvak's confident stride had slowed to something resembling actual caution. His prey should have been located, cornered and probably sobbing for rescue by now. Instead, his sensors were picking up traces of recent passage in half a dozen different cars, creating a pattern that suggested either his quarry had somehow learned to teleport, or was moving through the tunnel system with a level of efficiency that shouldn't have been possible for something so supposedly fragile. "Status report," he transmitted back to the observation deck, his crystalline voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty that any of the assembled aliens had ever heard from an apex warrior. "All vital signs normal," Brent replied, though his tone suggested that normal was not what anyone had been expecting. "Heart rate elevated but stable, no signs of panic or distress. Current location." He paused, checking his instruments with the sort of confusion typically reserved for discovering that mathematics had suddenly stopped working. "Unknown. Sensors show multiple possible positions." This was, technically speaking, accurate. Ava was currently moving through a maintenance shaft that ran parallel to 3 major corridors, and the station's internal sensors were having difficulty distinguishing between actual position and thermal echoes bouncing off the metallic wall. It was the sort of navigation challenge that would have been impossible for most species, but humans had evolved with an unusual talent for three-dimensional spatial reasoning and an almost supernatural ability to find their way through complex environments. Minute 15 brought the first sign that Garvak was beginning to understand he might have miscalculated. His movement pattern shifted from confident hunting to something that looked suspiciously like systematic searching. He'd begun retracing his steps, checking corridors he'd already cleared, and making the kind of tactical errors that came from dealing with prey that refused to behave predictably. Ava, meanwhile, had begun what could only be described as active stalking. She'd identified Garvak's movement pattern within the first 10 minutes of observation, and had started positioning herself to maintain visual contact while remaining undetected. The apex warrior's superior senses were designed to locate frightened prey, not to detect the presence of something that was deliberately following him. The psychological impact of this role reversal was beginning to show. Garvak's transmissions back to the observation deck were becoming more frequent and increasingly sharp-edged. His crystalline form, which had started the hunt moving with predatory confidence, now showed signs of the kind of tension that came from suddenly realizing that one might not be at the top of the food chain after all. "This is ridiculous," he transmitted, his voice carrying harmonics that his species only used when genuinely frustrated. "The readings make no sense. Either your sensors are malfunctioning, or this human has somehow learned to exist in multiple locations simultaneously." The truth, as observed from Ava's perspective, was considerably simpler. Garvak hunted the way his species had always hunted, by following obvious trails, pursuing direct confrontation, and relying on superior physical capabilities to overcome any resistance. These techniques worked wonderfully against prey that fought back or ran away in terror, but they were completely useless against something that had learned patience from millions of years of persistence hunting. Humans, it turned out, were very good at following things that didn't know they were being followed. Minute 18 brought the moment when Garvak finally understood that he was no longer the predator in this scenario. He'd been moving through a long corridor when he heard the sound, or rather the absence of sound, that indicated he was being observed. It wasn't anything dramatic, just the subtle shift in acoustic resonance that suggested someone was breathing in the shadows behind him. He spun around, sensors extended to maximum range, scanning for heat signatures and electromagnetic disturbances. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, showing no sign of recent passage, but the feeling of being watched remained, creating the sort of psychological pressure that his species had never evolved to handle. "Position report," he demanded, his voice now carrying the kind of edge that suggested genuine concern. Brent checked his instruments twice before responding. "Sensors indicate. I'm not entirely certain. Multiple contacts, possible interference, readings inconsistent with." He paused, the silence stretching long enough to make everyone in the observation deck uncomfortable. "Gorvak, are you certain the human is still in your sector?" The question hung in the recycled air like a challenge to everything the assembled aliens thought they understood about predator-prey relationships. Because if their sensors couldn't locate one small, fragile human in a controlled environment, what did that say about their understanding of human capabilities? Gorvak's response came after a pause that lasted several heartbeats too long. "I'm beginning to suspect," he said slowly, "that we may have underestimated our quarry." From her position in the shadows approximately 20 meters behind him, Ava allowed herself a small smile. The hunter was finally learning what it felt like to be hunted, and judging by the increasing tension in his movements, he was discovering that the experience was considerably less enjoyable from this perspective. Minute 20 arrived with Gorvak making increasingly erratic movements through the corridor system, his confident predatory stride replaced by the cautious paranoid gait of something that had suddenly realized it might be prey. His sensors swept continuously now, searching for threats rather than quarry, and his communications back to the observation deck had taken on the clipped professional tone that his species used when trying very hard not to admit they were out of their depth. The assembled aliens watched their champion's deteriorating confidence with growing unease, their various forms of superiority suddenly feeling less assured than they had an hour ago. Because if Gorvak, 3 centuries of hunting experience, apex predator, crystalline embodiment of evolutionary perfection, could be reduced to nervous paranoia by one small human, what did that suggest about the rest of their assumption? In the shadows of the maintenance tunnels, Ava checked her chronometer and began moving toward the central hub. 10 minutes left and she had a demonstration to complete. The central hub of Maintenance Sector 12 was a circular chamber roughly 30 meters in diameter, filled with the humming machinery that kept this section of the station operational. It was also, according to the exercise parameters, the designated safe zone that would constitute victory for the supposedly fragile human who was meant to be cowering in some corner by now begging for rescue. Ava arrived at the hub with 8 minutes remaining on the clock, and took a moment to appreciate the irony of the situation. The space was ringed with monitoring equipment that would clearly show her presence to the observers on the deck above, meaning her arrival here would be interpreted as either brilliant tactical thinking or dumb luck, depending on one's perspective regarding human intelligence. She settled herself comfortably against a main power coupling and waited for Gorvak to arrive, because by now she was certain he would. 3 centuries of hunting experience had taught him to recognize when prey was no longer running, and his increasingly frantic search pattern suggested he'd finally realized that his quarry was no longer hiding from him. The apex warrior's arrival was announced by the distinctive harmonic resonance of crystalline footsteps moving with what could charitably be described as extreme caution. He entered the hub with sensors extended and weapon systems primed, scanning for threats with the sort of methodical paranoia that came from having one's fundamental worldview thoroughly dismantled over the course of 20 minutes. Ava said pleasantly from her position near the power coupling. "There you are. I was starting to worry you'd gotten lost." Gorvak spun toward her voice, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the chamber's ambient lighting and patterns that suggested considerable agitation. For several long moments, he simply stared at her, apparently trying to reconcile the image of a small human sitting calmly in the safe zone, with everything he thought he understood about predator-prey dynamics. He finally managed, his crystalline voice carrying harmonics that his translator struggled to render into anything approaching coherent language. "How what?" Ava asked with the sort of innocent curiosity that was absolutely guaranteed to make the situation worse. How did I get here? How did I avoid your sensors? How did I manage not to panic and call for help? You'll need to be more specific. The monitoring station above was buzzing with activity as the assembled aliens attempted to process what their instruments were telling them. Ava's vital signs remained steady, showing no signs of the exhaustion or stress that should have resulted from 20-plus minutes of being hunted by an apex predator. More disturbing still, the tracking data suggested that she'd spent a significant portion of the exercise following Gorvac rather than fleeing from him. Brent's voice crackled through the comm system, carrying the sort of bewilderment typically reserved for discovering that the fundamental constants of physics had been revised without notice. Gorvac, please confirm your status. Sensors indicate both participants are now in the central hub, but the tracking data suggests irregular movement patterns. The tracking data, Gorvac replied slowly, his gaze never leaving Ava's relaxed form, suggests that I have spent the last 20 minutes being systematically outmaneuvered by what we assumed was prey. This statement created a moment of silence in the observation deck that stretched long enough for several nearby star systems to complete their rotations. The concept that an apex warrior, the pinnacle of evolutionary development, the embodiment of perfect predatory capability, could be outmaneuvered by anything, let alone a human, was so fundamentally contrary to established galactic understanding that it required a complete recalibration of everything they thought they knew. Yexer was the first to break the silence, his pack hunter instincts apparently more adaptable than his colleagues' worldviews. The movement patterns we observed, those were hunting behaviors, weren't they? She was tracking me, Gorvac confirmed, his voice carrying the sort of stunned realization that came from discovering that one had been starring in a completely different story than originally assumed. Following me, learning my patterns, my preferences, my tactical limitations. I was never hunting her, she was hunting me. Ava smiled, the expression somehow managing to be both friendly and absolutely terrifying. Your species evolved on a world where the prey announces its presence by running and screaming. That's why your hunting techniques focus on speed and superior senses, rather than patience or pattern recognition. You're excellent at catching things that want to escape, but you've never learned to deal with something that doesn't run. The implications of this observation rippled through the assembled aliens, like a shockwave through a stellar medium. If humans weren't the fragile, easily intimidated creatures they'd been classified as, if they were instead something that could outthink and outmaneuver an apex warrior, then what else had the galaxy gotten wrong about Earth's supposedly harmless species? Plea, whose partial existence outside normal spacetime had given him perspectives that most beings considered borderline mystical, leaned forward with obvious interest. The classification system rates species based on physical durability and obvious capabilities. But human, you evolved as persistence hunters, didn't you? You don't overpower your prey, you outlast it, outthink it, wear it down until it makes mistakes. Among other things, Ava agreed cheerfully, we're also quite good at pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and adapting to new environments. Plus we tend to be remarkably difficult to discourage once we've decided we want something. But I suppose those traits are harder to measure than, say, the ability to survive in hard vacuum. Gorvac's crystalline form had gone completely still, the kind of absolute motionlessness that his species used when processing information that required significant recalibration of existing worldviews. The diplomatic incident, he said slowly, Ambassador Chen and the crystal relic, that wasn't clumsiness, was it? Ava's smile widened. Have you ever tried to shake hands with someone who can juggle plasma? The trick is gauging exactly how much pressure to apply so that you seem appropriately respectful while demonstrating that you're not quite as fragile as everyone assumed. The observation deck had gone completely silent, filled with beings who were suddenly reassessing every interaction they'd ever had with humans. The species they'd been treating with condescending protectiveness, the supposedly fragile newcomers they'd been so careful to shield from the harsh realities of galactic civilization, had been quietly demonstrating capabilities that their entire classification system had completely missed. Brent's voice finally broke the silence, carrying the sort of careful respect that one used when addressing something that might be considerably more dangerous than it appeared.
Perhaps we should reconsider our understanding of human capability. From her comfortable position against the power coupling, Ava checked her chronometer and noted that they still had 3 minutes left on the exercise clock. That might be wise, she agreed, though I should mention that this was just a friendly game of hide and seek. I'd hate for anyone to think humans were actually trying to be impressive. The assembled aliens exchanged glances that ranged from concerned to terrified, because if this casual demonstration of tactical superiority was what humans considered not trying to be impressive, then the galaxy had severely underestimated what Earth's children were capable of when they actually put their minds to something. Gorvax straightened to his full 11-foot height, his crystalline form catching the chamber's light in patterns that somehow managed to suggest newfound respect. I believe, he said carefully, that I may have called you fragile at some point during our previous conversations. Ava's smile turned genuinely warm. You did, and I believe I mentioned that we were full of surprises. Indeed, he paused, processing implications with the methodical thoroughness of a being who had just learned that everything he thought he knew was wrong.
Though I suspect fragile may not be the most accurate descriptor for a species that can turn a hunter into prey without the hunter even realizing what's happening. In the end, the hierarchy of species would require significant revision, though it would take the galactic community several decades to fully understand the implications of what they'd witnessed that day. The lesson, for those wise enough to learn it, was elegantly simple. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't look dangerous at all. And sometimes when the universe calls you fragile, the best response is to smile and prove them wrong.